I'm Holly Page, co-founder of No Labels, here for another edition of No Labels Talks with the intellectual powerhouse that drives the whole movement of problem-solving politics, Ryan Clancy.
That movement is in really, really big trouble, if that's true.
I just was on a call earlier, Ryan, with a big fan of yours who said that Ryan Clancy sure is persuasive.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That person is probably on my payroll.
Well, he was 90, but still.
I have a special rapport with that age bracket.
Do you know what I've decided? I've decided that this is a politics born of wisdom.
Like,
After you've tried everything else and you realize none of the other things work, it's time to come here. But at any rate, how are you? What did you think of the big debate last night?
I was pleasantly surprised for the first time in a long time, just because it was like I don't know, it reminded me of what politics used to be like. Not that I'm old and remember days of yore or whatever, but when it was like sort of normal, they were kind of civil to each other. They actually talked about issues at the end. Like their spouses both came on stage and they were cordial to each other, compared to the Trump-Harris debate. Like, just, you could cut that tension with a knife. They just hated each other so much.
Yeah, totally agree. It was an interesting dynamic to watch last night. And, the thing that really stood out to me was really both the vice presidential candidates in their own way, to the extent that they were talking about the agenda of the administration of either Trump or Harris. It was different versions of what can be given to the American people. And I thought what was really interesting, considering all the sobering conversations that we've hosted here at No Labels Talks, there really was no even tipping of the hat of any sort of reckoning that's going to have to happen with our deficit and entitlements. No sort of from JD Vance, actually, I was kind of surprised. No sort of conversation about, government has its limits. It can do a lot, and there are many things only government can do, but it can't do everything. But that was kind of void, and this feeds into the larger conversation we've been having about so many elected officials treating voters like customers and not citizens.
Yeah.
So I'll take the win that they were cordial and respected each other, or seemed to respect each other, at least on the stage. But we want to encourage, a more honest conversation with the American people about what lies ahead for us.
Well, Nora O'Donnell did try it once. So she had a question where she cited this Penn Wharton has a model where they game out the fiscal impact of the candidates' plans. And the model shows both of them, both Harris and Trump, their plans blowing up the deficit. And O'Donnell asked about that and said, like, how are you going to pay for it? And they just, talked right around it and pretended that wasn't the question, and said some generic stuff about the middle class, and on they went. But, eventually reality is going to intercede, and they're going to actually have to have a thought about what to do about that.
Agreed. I have a question for you. Why do you think it was that Ukraine did not come up last night?
It's interesting. Well, you know what? I think part of it was just the events of yesterday and Iran's attack on Israel. That kind of took up all the oxygen of the foreign policy discussion at the beginning. And I guess, they only had so much time to get through all the other stuff. But I mean, it is a pretty glaring omission that didn't come up. I mean, I understand that this is not like Iraq or Afghanistan in the sense that you have American boots on the ground with troops in harm's way, but we're in it,
We are in it, and it seems to be a differentiating point between the two campaigns, which is why I was very curious to see what they both were going to say.
Well, you know what the thing, I mean, this is the really unfortunate thing is absolutely no one has defined what the end game is.
Mhm.
So basically what you get is Biden and Harris say, we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And Trump says, I'll solve this in a day, right? With just like typical bravado. But it's like, okay, but to what end? What does, from the perspective of the United States, what does success look like? Like, is it really we're gonna push Russia all the way back to the pre-2008 lines? Okay, if it is, say it. Like, it's just that nobody has articulated a vision for what a win from our perspective is supposed to look like.
It's these lessons of the of Vietnam and other uh, conflicts that we can read about in our history book, but we seem to forget when we're dealing with the here and now. So you're absolutely right, and hopefully we will get an answer to that very important question in the coming years.
Yeah, one would hope. Well, look, it was, notwithstanding the, gaps in the debate, they did get to a lot of stuff. There was a ton of policy discussion. Like, you could tell they were citing actual legislation and plans, and there was detail. I give them both credit. They did their homework.
Agreed. And I appreciated that they both acknowledged common ground, there on the stage. Because as because you helped define it, this politics isn't about everybody having the exact same point of view. It's about respecting that it's a big, diverse country. People have different opinions and have reached different conclusions, but we have to find our way forward together. So we have to identify where it is that we can work together and move forward from that. And I thought they did a great job with that. I actually thought the whole debate was kind of a nod to our effort to give voice to the common sense majority, because clearly they're looking at the general voters, of which common sense majority does show up for that. And trying to communicate in a way, in a style that connects with them.
They were clearly outcompeting one another to be reasonable. You're right. It was unusual to see them say, I agree with you. In fact, and the credit for this goes to Peyton on our research team. He actually found out that they said that 11 times.
Wow.
It's the first time that phrase has been uttered in a debate since 2016. So that is not something, that is often said in debates, but that was good to see.
Awesome.
Well, look, in any case, the people we brought together today were a couple journalists who are really plugged in. Julia Manchester from The Hill and Hans Nichols from Axios. And they really provided some great perspective, not only on the debate, but what else they thought we could expect in this closing 1 month stretch of the campaign. So everybody enjoy this week's edition of No Labels Talks. Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here for another episode of No Labels Talks. And coming off the vice presidential debate last night between Governor Walz and Senator Vance, we thought it would make sense to pull together a panel here of people who follow this stuff for a living. And I have with us Julia Manchester. Julia is the national political reporter for The Hill. She's often on their sister cable network, News Nation, and regularly appears on CNN, Fox, MSNBC to talk about the day's news. Julia, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Sure. And also with us is Hans Nichols, who's a political reporter for Axios. Hans writes their sneak peek newsletter, which you can get every evening as a really informative look ahead to what's happening in Washington. He was formerly with NBC News, where, among many other roles, he was the Pentagon correspondent. Hans, thank you also for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start here, Julia. I'm sure you've been getting spun all day by both sides who are telling you their respective candidate won the campaign or won the debate. But what was your initial impressions coming out of last night?
Yeah, so my initial impression was really how civil it was between these two candidates and how many times I heard these two people say, "Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you." They disagree on, how to fix an issue, for example, but there did seem to be at least some common ground on identifying where the problems were, and that's something we really haven't seen in the past number of presidential elections. I mean, gosh, I remember watching the last one between President Trump and Vice President Harris, and I thought it was remarkable that she even across the stage to shake his hand. That's something we hadn't seen in a while either. So definitely, I think in this time of really intense partisanship, bickering, it was almost refreshing to watch this. But then going into, I think, the delivery from both of the candidates. Look, I think Senator Vance probably had the best night in terms of delivery. He is someone who comes off as very polished. He is a good debater. He clearly felt very comfortable on that stage. I think he had gotten quite a bit of practice in the run up to last night's debate because he'd been doing cable news hits and media hits really across the political spectrum, going on outlets that may be perceived by Trump world and Republicans as maybe a bit unfriendly towards them. He really went into, as they would say, the belly of the beast. For Governor Walz, though, he's someone who, obviously came off, and the Harris campaign is definitely, pushing this narrative. They say he came off as a normal person, but at the same time, I would say he came off as a bit uncomfortable on stage. He seemed to be at some points maybe a little out of his element, particularly towards the beginning of the debate. And then, of course, during that very infamous moment of him talking about how he was in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square protest, that was certainly an awkward moment. So I think Vance, certainly from a delivery perspective, was the most comfortable, whereas Walz was a little shaky. But at the end of the day, I think there's a question as to how much this debate will actually move the needle. I think most voters, when they, go to the polls on election day or vote early or by mail, they're typically voting for the president.
Hans, what about you? I mean, Julia talked about the civility of this debate, which is almost like a little time capsule. It's like a Bob Dole kind of debate where the candidates weren't seething with animosity for each other the whole time. What did you think of it?
Well, we can only do Bob Dole references if we all speak in the third person for the rest of this conversation. So Hans Nichols disagrees with you, Ryan Clancy. No, look, it was civil, it was substantive. My only real complaint with it was that it started at 9 p.m. and then it went on till 10:30. Like, I don't know why we do this. I don't have a good answer. Like, the world we don't always cater to the West Coast. The West Coast certainly doesn't cater to the East Coast when they're scheduling their football games. So, there's an old rule for political reporters. What happens in the second half of the debate stays in the second half of the debate, because we're all writing the debate during the debate. And then you want to have your story go out right away. So you kind of gloss over and you're half listening. That was true last night. And Walz improved throughout the evening, but that last part where he was probably a little bit stronger didn't necessarily matter for the first round of coverage. The second and third round of coverage, it just has to do with clippable, snackable, shareable moments. And the Walz people feel like they feel like they had a couple moments there, especially on January 6th, that cut an ad on it already. And I suspect the Trump Vance people do as well. So too long, too late, but first round of scoring clearly went to JD Vance.
Interesting. Oh, so for any political reporter, obviously there's two layers to these debate. There's when you watch it, and then there's in the hours and day after it, where you just get inundated with spin about what you're supposed to think about it. I'm curious, Julia, from the respective campaigns and parties, what are they trying to emphasize to you today? What are they, trying to get you to focus on?
Well, the Trump campaign is certainly putting out this narrative of, him and Vance as a team. I think the president posted or on Truth Social, or I might have seen it on his X account. I can't remember which one, but, him and JD Vance driving, for example, they are very much trying to tout this as a team, really capitalizing on his performance, capitalizing on him as someone who is his right-hand man, in that. So that's to be expected after his performance. Like I said earlier, I think the Harris campaign, Harris allies are, very much, they're portraying JD Vance as a sleek politician. That's how someone put it to me, someone who is sleek, someone who is experienced in this. But Tim Walz is maybe the more, relatable, normal person, someone that most Americans can relate to, someone who maybe you want to have a beer with, for example. So they are pushing that, perspective. I think a lot of Harris allies going into this understood that JD Vance is a skilled debater. I don't think that necessarily surprised anyone, but I think they're pushing this narrative that Tim Walz is someone who is more relatable, more down to earth, like more Americans. It's been interesting to see, the reaction to Senator Vance's comments on abortion. Abortion and reproductive health care is an issue that Republicans just haven't been able to really drill down their messaging on. They're not united on that issue. Even former President Trump has suggested that this is a tough issue for them. So to see them continue to, hit JD Vance on that issue after his, remarks last night, and he even, seemed to acknowledge last night that this is a problem area for some Republicans in terms of how they address the issue. But, Democrats, unsurprisingly, really trying to drill in on that as a vulnerability point for them.
Hans, obviously, the conventional wisdom on VP debates is that they don't really matter. Though, of course, the difference with this one is one, it could be the last debate, where it's usually sandwiched in between presidential debates. And of course, we only had one presidential debate between the main contenders. So given that this year is a little different, do you expect this is going to move things much in one direction or another?
I'd be lying if I said I had an answer to that. It does feel, though, as even though we're saturated in a pretty rich news environment right now, right? Like there's, I was offline for a couple hours at a source lunch, and I was just wanting to see the latest on the Middle East, right? There's a lot going on in the world, and your well-informed viewers can correct me that the presidential kind of seems sleepy, right? Everyone's going through the motions. Okay, the president's down in South Carolina meeting with Republicans, and then he'll do the flyover, and then he'll have the briefing in Raleigh. And so neutral presidential news environment where there's not that much, and we've been all so kind of inured to these big shocking developments in the presidential campaign. When it's just kind of a normal October day, it seems like the default is a little more neutral. And I think that the neutral default in some ways hurts the Harris-Walz campaign, because they had been riding so high. And they'd had this momentum and good news cycle after good news cycle. They really haven't had a bad news cycle, with maybe the exception of Waltz and the Tiananmen Square thing, which sort of started resting yesterday and probably broke during the campaign. So if you look at sort of an every day that's a draw between the various media camps, is maybe slightly things trending back towards Trump, which is to say that his numbers are better than the economy, people don't like immigration, and the world is on fire. And it's a gross mischaracterization, or sort of an easy sort of not mischaracterization, sort of simplification. In that kind of environment, a 60-40 Vance win over Waltz might kind of have a longer runway. So, but again, I want to be very clear that I don't necessarily believe anything I just said. I just wanted to throw it out there as one possible theory.
Can I ask you both, as far as you understand it, is this almost certainly the last debate? I mean, I know that the Harris campaign is still, but go ahead, Hans.
I'm never going to make a prediction when Donald Trump's involved.
Yeah.
I think it's the last debate if both sides think that the dynamic of the race hasn't changed. What Trump's last debate posture tells us is that their internal polling is better than the public polling, and that they think that they don't necessarily need to, hit the last wire on the aircraft carrier. They feel pretty comfortable out there where they are. If that changes, I suspect you start hearing Donald Trump talking about more debates.
Can you expand on that just a little bit in terms of their internal polling? What in particular are they seeing in their polling? Like, are they just up in Pennsylvania more than?
With internal polling, you always want to be very careful, because they rarely share the crosstabs with reporters. You sort of hear the echo of it, and you hear, you'll hear it from a Senate campaign. Well, Trump's campaign has him up 3 in Pennsylvania, for example. So I don't have actually looking at the crosstabs. I don't know how good the poll is. I'm just sort of inferring that their polling is good based on their behavior. And they are not acting like a campaign that is down 2 or 3, which is what, depending what aggregation of polls you look at on the public side, that's where it's at. Now, my argument can be easily punctured, which is to say that Donald Trump is afraid of debating Kamala Harris again, and he thinks it'll go worse. And so if that's your theory, it tells us absolutely nothing about their internal polling. It just tells us that there's it's an indication there's a candidate that doesn't want to go face to face with his opponent so close to the election.
Yeah. Julia, I want to ask you about, we're into October now. Of course, that's when everybody starts thinking about October surprises. And already it does look like there's at least 2 things that could qualify. We have the longshoremen's strike here on the Eastern Seaboard. Not a big issue now. If people can't get bananas 2 weeks from now in the grocery store, suddenly that could become an issue. And of course, we have the situation in Israel in the wake of the Iranians attacking Israel. Everybody's waiting to see how Israel will respond. But in either of these cases, do you think an October surprise is necessarily a negative for Harris, given that she's probably the incumbent? Or are there scenarios where it might not put a dent in her?
Yeah, and just to add on to those events you mentioned, the strike, and then of course the situation in the Middle East. I think the hurricanes, Hurricane Helene, that impact could play into this, and I think that could tie certainly into the strike, considering this is all impacting the East Coast and could have a major economic impact on it. Look, I think it's hard to say. I could see an October surprise potentially helping Harris, and obviously potentially hurting her. It's really when I think about an October surprise, my mind goes back to the first presidential debate I covered, race I covered, and that was in 2016 with Donald Trump, and obviously that very infamous Access Hollywood tape. I mean, I think a lot of us were in our heads maybe writing his political obituary right after that, and it didn't, have that effect. Obviously, it didn't have as negative effect as we thought it would, and he obviously went on to win, that election. So it's hard for me to, I think, make these predictions in terms of October surprises when we've already had so much happening. I mean, the events of yesterday being October 1st, we've had 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump. You've had one presidential candidate, a sitting president, drop out of the race for the vice president to replace him. So it's hard for me to see how this could have an impact. I think the cake is baked for a lot of voters. The question it really is those undecided, swing voters in these, key swing states. And I guess it would depend on what the October surprise is. I think a lot of these voters are more interested in kitchen table issues. I know that's a cliche, but policy, economics, that kind of a thing. So, it's without having an October surprise scenario in front of me, I don't think I can properly make that prediction.
Hans, what's your understanding of how the Harris campaign is trying to do a very delicate balancing act, which is, of course, as the vice president, I mean, she's got some, significant responsibilities as it relates to the response to the hurricanes. We saw the other day, she was apparently in the Situation Room with President Biden as the attack on Israel is unfolding. How are they balancing those 2 things, or need to be out on the campaign trail with her day job?
Well, they're doing it with visuals, right? So they'll release a photo, and that drives the message. So that minimizes the risk for her misspeaking or any sort of unscripted interaction with reporters. The day job, again, this is to my sleepy point. It doesn't feel like we're in October of an election year where there are 3 rallies a day. Reporters haven't seen like their own pillow. You wake up. I mean, my first real campaign was 2008. And I remember this, I got to a certain comforting spot where I'd wake up in a hotel room and be terrified. And then 90 seconds later, 9 milliseconds later, be like, it's okay, you're on the campaign, you're in a Westin, right? And for those of us who spend too much time in Westins, they all have a unique smell. It doesn't feel like it this cycle. It doesn't feel like the campaigns are going all out. They're throwing haymakers. It just feels like exhaustion. And maybe I'm speaking for myself, and it's true. I just don't know if I'm transposing that on the rest of the country. But the campaigns don't feel, and this is really true when you look at the tempo of Trump's campaigning. in 2024 versus 2016. He was out there 2-3 times as much. And so, you know, I'll tell you a story that we'll do, and if Julia wants to steal it, do it faster and better, that's fine. But we should just look at the actual campaign schedules in the month of September and just go back. And I mean, this doesn't feel like Romney, like just do the last month. September, Romney, Harris, September. Those have different tempos. You know, 2020, everyone kind of gets a mulligan because of the pandemic and whatnot. 2008, like September, you did 2 or 3 states a day at this time of the campaign. And it's a little bit different for the incumbent because they get to go home and they either get Air Force One or Air Force Two, and you get, you know, you do a couple nights back in DC, or you're only on the road 1 or 2. But so that's a long-winded way of saying the day job being the vice president, they can handle visually. The sort of extracurricular job running for president, they're really not doing that intensely. And, you know, before I write a firm story on this, I'd want all the numbers to sort of validate that. But that's what it feels like. And as just someone who's covered campaigns like this in the past, it just doesn't feel like we're in October.
I mean, Julia, do you have an expectation for any major tentpole moments coming up in this last month? I mean, we've, of course, there's been a lot of coverage of the lack of media access, particularly on, you know, for the Harris campaign. But we don't have any more debates. It looks like Trump was supposed to do a 60 Minutes interview that he is now not going to do. Are there any other moments coming up that you're looking at where you expect the eyes of the country will be focused, or will this kind of be a narrow-casted final month of the campaign where they're just, you know, in whatever state they're in and trying to talk to that group of voters?
Yeah, look, I think unless we see their schedules both pick up quite a bit, it could be, as Hans was saying, sleepy going forward. I hope it isn't. I mean, I want to see more of an exciting campaign. I would love to see Kamala Harris and Tim Walz do more interviews and do more interviews separately too. You know, I think that will certainly be interesting to get that one-on-one take. I think you'll continue to see JD Vance do the rounds in media, you know, in outlets that are perceived as friendly and unfriendly towards him. I think Donald Trump, too, could, you know, continue to do those interviews, even though I know that the 60 Minutes one fell through, but I'm sure he will go on some friendlier outlets or more friendlier territory going forward. I am, you know, in terms of I guess it's not getting as much coverage as, you know, other events, but I am curious to see how both of these campaigns handle the situation with Hurricane Helene. I know that Harris is obviously going there in her capacity as vice president, but, you know, the politics of hurricanes are so fascinating to me. You know, I grew up in Orlando, and in 2004, during that presidential election, Central Florida and the state of Florida, Central Florida was hit by 3 consecutive hurricanes that fall. The state of Florida got 4 consecutive hurricanes, and during that time, we saw the Bush-Kerry race really, you know, impacted by these hurricanes. You saw George W. Bush be able to go down and, you know, survey the damage and use the bully pulpit in a way, or his status as president, to really get out there in what was at a time considered a major swing state. For John Kerry, it was a very awkward moment for him because he was, you know, he was not going there in his capacity as, you know, a federal official. He was invited there by Bill Nelson to survey the damage, but then got some pushback for, you know, from his critics saying it was too political. So I am curious to see the politics of this hurricane and how that impacts things. Obviously, in battleground North Carolina and Georgia, I think it could play a big role. But at the same time, you know, they're going there, like I said, Harris in her official capacity. I think Trump has to be very careful about how he approaches this. I understand he has a GoFundMe, you know, set up for people who have been impacted. But that's the one thing I'm looking out for at the moment. But, you know, unless we see a major interview opportunity, potentially another debate. I mean, I don't think at this point, it seems like most people I chat with don't think that's going to happen. I would like to see one, but, you know, right now it just seems definitely quieter than usual at this point in presidential.
Well, one impact we know the hurricane is going to have is it was already reported that early voting in North Carolina is going to start later now, just because there's big chunks of the state that you can't get access to. So we'll have to be on the lookout for that. Before we get to questions, I want to ask you both about some things you reported on recently, starting with you, Hans, which is, you made an interesting observation the other day where, of course, besides the presidential race, there's the race for the Senate and the House. The way this looks is that Republicans will almost certainly win West Virginia, Joe Manchin's seat, which would bring the Senate to 50-50. And then you start looking at several states that are currently held by Democrats, like Montana, like Ohio. One of the things you noted, though, Hans, is that in almost every state, the Republican Senate candidate seems to be polling pretty well behind former President Trump.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about that a little more and why
Well,
that might be happening?
It's an interesting dynamic because and I don't want this to come across as partisan or political at all, but in most salons that I inhabit, Donald Trump is thought to be somewhat of a pariah, right? I think in most of Washington, D.C., it's rare to kind of go to a Trumpy event. And so it's puzzling for people that Trump is running, in some cases, anywhere from 8 to 4 points ahead of just a generic Republican. Now, some of those states, it's somewhat explainable by unique circumstances, right? Like, say, take Arizona. Trump is running well ahead of Kerry Lake. But it's also true in Ohio, where Trump is very popular. And then, Bernie Moreno, the GOP challenger there, isn't as well known. What the theory of the case was always is that there wouldn't really be a whole lot of coattails for either candidate in either direction, but that it would narrow, right? And this is the idea of narrowing towards the end. The stat that everyone likes, in the last 2 presidential cycles, there have been 69 Senate races where the senator has been up, as has the presidential candidate. And in 68 of them, it's gone, the presidential and the Senate race has gone the same way every time. The only exception is Susan Collins in Maine in 2000. Now, here's what Susan Collins had going for her. She knows the state incredibly well. It's a small state with not a lot of inflows or outflows, not a huge amount of migration. And if anyone here is from on the call from Maine, please correct me, but I feel like Maine is one of those fairly static states, at least in terms of demographics. And so there's this sort of roiling discussion going on about, is split ticket voting coming back? And it could. The places that I think it could come back is if Ruben Gallego wins in Arizona and Trump wins Arizona, well, there are a number of split ticket voters there. You could see that if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania and Bob Casey holds on to Pennsylvania, then Pennsylvania will have some split ticket voting. So it's, we're getting to the point where there shouldn't be that much of a gap between Republican generic candidates and a Republican or former president or Republican candidate. One thing that's sort of interesting on this, Jim Banks, running for congressman from Indiana, running for Senate, he kind of made this point, and he's like, look, Trump is just finds voters other than we do. That's always been Trump's, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that's Trump's secret power, is he has found voters that exist out there that haven't been traditional Republicans. Some of it's the realignment of parties, right? Like working class, white, non-college working class voters are now more likely to be Republican. Some of that's switching around, but it's definitely something that's new, that's happening, and it could narrow, and there could be no difference on election day. But right now, there does look like there's a difference, and it's puzzling to me, probably vexing to Republicans. So I just find it interesting.
Well, that's something we'll be watching. The other thing we'll be watching, and Julia, you reported on this, is there are several really key ballot initiatives on states across the country. And look, this is something that going back years, I remember Karl Rove did this in 2004 when they had gay marriage on the ballot in Ohio. Parties will sometimes really try to drive ballot initiatives on the thought that, hey, if you might not otherwise come out to just vote for a candidate, you're going to vote for this ballot initiative. What are the ballot initiatives that are out there in states across the country that could matter and could actually meaningfully drive turnout?
So I've been mainly focused on the Florida ballot initiative. So Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. amendment through the amendment to legalize recreational, marijuana statewide, and then of course to enshrine abortion rights into Florida's constitution. Florida is such a fascinating state in this way, in that the state has a history of voters voting for more left-leaning ballot measures and then turning around and electing Republicans up and down the ballot. So, for example, in 2020, we saw the voters, vote in favor of raising the minimum wage, but Donald Trump won Florida. And then we saw in 2022, Republicans swept that state in the midterms, was sort of the, the one state that saw a red wave in the year that we were supposed to see a nationwide red wave, but didn't. So we're seeing that, the politics of these ballot initiatives play out, particularly in the Senate race and also in the presidential race in Florida. So, for example, you have Donald Trump making the calculation that he is going to support the amendment to legalize recreational marijuana, in an effort to really drive out, to attract younger voters in the state, for example. But then you have Senator Rick Scott, and Rick Scott gets a lot of his support from the Naples area and other predominantly retirement communities across the state that polling shows have been more opposed to this to this amendment. For example, in Collier County, which is Rick Scott's home county, the county commission voted to oppose this amendment, or spoke out, or had a resolution to speak out against the amendment. So they're both looking at this very differently. Now, abortion is also proving to be tricky for both of these candidates and how they address this. Republicans in Florida I speak to, are predicting that, it's very possible we could see 60%, the threshold to pass a ballot amendment in Florida. 60% of voters say they would like to enshrine abortion rights in the state's constitution, but still see Rick Scott and Donald Trump, win election in Florida. You've seen Rick Scott and Donald Trump both come out against the amendment to enshrine abortion rights in the Constitution. But, other Democrats I speak to in the state, and you see, former Congresswoman Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who is really speaking out on this amendment in particular. She's challenging Rick Scott. She's using this to try to bring down, Republicans in the state. And you're seeing the Harris campaign try to tap into that as well. The Democrats I speak to say, look, of course, there is that history of Floridians voting for more left-leaning ballot measures and electing Republicans. But the difference here is that Florida now has a 6-week ban, or a 6-week restriction on abortion in place. And that's what sort of raises the stakes here. So I think at the end of the day, we could see some split ticket voting. And that way, I am curious to see how abortion plays. I know that Governor DeSantis is really pushing Republicans facing reelection up and down the ballot in Florida, particularly in the House, to come out and support the amendment, or come out against the amendment to enshrine abortion rights in the state's constitution. It's sort of putting some Republicans, like Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna from Western Florida, the Tampa area, in a very difficult position. She's, essentially saying, my opinion on this doesn't matter at the end of the day, sort of backing away from it. But, certainly, the politics of abortion and marijuana, threatening to royal races in that state.
Interesting. Well, we'll be watching that closely. Looks like we got a couple questions. And if you could just say your name and where you're from, we'll try to get to you. Let's start with Daniel. Daniel, go ahead. Daniel, I think you're muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Hi, Daniel from Scottsdale, Arizona. So I agree with Hans and Julia. It looks like absolutely nothing is happening out there, that they're not campaigning, and it's a weird kind of election. But I'm an older kind of a guy. Is it possible there's a lot going on social media that I'm just not seeing, and that they really are actively campaigning somehow on social media?
My teenager just got home, so let me ask her. Yeah, but you're not missing that much. If there's some of it. I mean, again, I'm not I don't want to date myself too much. I'm 49 years old. I don't there's not that, it can't all be virtual, right? And like people like you still vote a lot more. So if they are just counting on some sort of like, TikTok generation to for an entire campaign unfolds in social media, that's fine. And they're going to only win the people on social media. And I'd probably even bank on a bunch of Florida stoners to turn out to vote more than I would like all the TikTok kids, right? Because they're not like, so you're not missing anything. We should turn this whole thing over to you, and you should tell us what's happening in Scottsdale, because that's like, is that Juan Ciscomani, or who has that district?
David Schweiker.
Okay, well, Schweiker's interesting too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So on the same thing, then why do you guys and me think nothing is happening? What has happened to elections that all of a sudden nobody's out there electioning?
Go ahead, Julia, you want to take that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mean why we don't? You're thinking all the. I just want to understand your question. Why isn't anything happening? You're thinking all the activity is happening on social media, and that's being.
No, I don't think I agree with Hans.
Right.
It is or not, but I would know then. But clearly, I'm not seeing campaigns. I'm not seeing rallies. I'm not seeing interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Has something fundamentally shifted with the world since COVID, or since social media, or has electioning really completely changed all of a sudden?
Now I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I am curious, just going back to the midterms though, and covering the midterms, I mean, it did seem like, granted, very different from a presidential race, but it did seem like campaigns were in full swing. We were all in person. There was a lot of obviously canvassing, door knocking. It was definitely felt like a more traditional campaign. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think the first few things that pop into my mind here are the events of this past summer. We saw Donald Trump, for example, those 2 assassination attempts against him, particularly the first one. I am curious to see what impact that's had on his, style of campaigning. I know that he likes to be out in these big open spaces with, thousands of people in the crowd, preferably outside. And I think the assassination attempts have, sort of changed that calculus. And there's a question of, how much resources he can get from Secret Service to be safe. And that's obviously an ongoing debate here in Washington and in the political world. For Vice President Harris, though, it's a good question. I think she has been out there, but it doesn't seem, like we were saying before, it doesn't seem like to the same extent as past candidates have been. She was sort of, put into this somewhat last minute, very quickly. But I think right now, chatting with, those around her campaign, it seems like the strategy is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think at both campaigns understand that this is going to be a margin of error election, very, very close, but, they feel, somewhat good about where they are. There's nervousness, so there's trepidation, but there's a reason why they're sticking with this strategy, because she still is ahead in a number of polls. It's not a comfortable margin, but she still is ahead.
Thank you.
Just a quick theory for you, Daniel, and like I'll open this up. It could just be local news isn't as vibrant, right? Like it used to be that, like, the Arizona Republic would, and so you would hear more ricochets of news stories, even if you weren't necessarily following them. You'd be like, oh, Mitt Romney was in town doing he was up in Prescott doing a rally. I don't know. And like you might not necessarily go to that in person, but you were like vaguely aware that Mitt Romney was in town, and you heard it like at the barber shop or something like that. I just like, we haven't quite priced it out as a country what the death of local news means across all levels, again, so from school council to school boards to county councils to congressional to presidential. But that just a theory. And then I'm being a bit hyperbolic. The campaign's going on. I think one other thing I'd add to this, and then I'll let someone ask this question, is that maybe Arizona isn't as in play as we think it is. And so, it's a long way to go. And if you're Kamala Harris and you just need to win Georgia and Arizona, like, why go out to Arizona twice a week and hedge there when your internal polling, if true, I'm just like guessing here, if your internal polling has you down, because you're in the air for a long time, and you can just be much more surgical and efficient by doing Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia.
Yeah. Thanks, Hans. Al, you have a question.
Sure. I'm Al Bartell, and I'm in Georgia, and I'm close to that North Carolina line and the Florida line. So my question goes to This hurricane, man, has flattened everything. There was nothing moving. All the focus is on it, and it's going to definitely impact somebody's base, turnout, and participation. My question is the media willing to, pull on the tail of this sleeping giant and put all that on display, and particularly at the local news level, because that impact in Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina is critical. It's going to impact voter turnout. The question is, are the media going to put it on display? What say you?
I think there is certainly an effort by the media, by the news media, to cover this. We've been looking into the impacts that this will have on, early voting, mail-in voting, particularly in North Carolina. I think right now, though, we're sort of from my perspective, at least, I can't speak for other journalists or Hans, but I think right now we're sort of waiting to see how this plays out, because once the recovery efforts take place, once we things get hopefully things get cleaned up and we return to some semblance of normalcy in that area. I mean, I don't know how long that will take. I know this has been pretty devastating. We'll have a clearer idea. I think it may be too soon to tell right now, but I think give it a week or so, or a few weeks, and we could have a clearer idea of what that will look like.
Thanks, Julia.
It's a great story idea. We should just do the counties that are most devastated and whether or not they're more Republican or Democrat. Just a quick chart. We should do it. There's usually after a natural disaster, you don't want to jump into the politics too quickly, although we all want to. So, someone that used to be in network news, the challenge right now, if you're a network news correspondent, is to be standing in some devastating area and talking to families who have been hit particularly hard. And I don't mean to be that sort of cynical about it, but you want to bring out the emotion of the story and just the raw power of the storm. And so the first, few days of this are dedicated to images of just how disastrous the storm is. And that happens for at least the national broadcast. I don't know about local TV. So the second or third order stories will be what you're suggesting, and it's a good idea, and we should do it.
Andy, go ahead. Andy has a question.
You hear me?
Yep.
Great. My name's Andy. I'm in Wisconsin. I'm 41 years old. I'm an electrical engineer. And actually, it's really funny. There's a lot of things that were said on here I really would resonate with. But a couple of things is we talk a lot about rhetoric on both the right and the left. Have you ever considered, kind of just centrist rhetoric and how we're talking about changing things, common sense, sort of governance and things like that? Why don't we have a presidential candidate right now? Everything is split, 49%, 49%. No one is satisfied. Everybody says we want a third option. Why do we not have a presidential candidate put forth by no labels? I really believe the only way we can get out of this election without any sort of, I hate to even say violence, but, is getting a landslide. And I believe getting somebody from the center that's actually, appealing broadly to everybody and has a true pro-social agenda would be very straightforward, kind of a no-brainer for most people. The way I think about it, the Democratic experiment needs a control group. I'm an engineer, so a lot of science jokes.
Well, thank you, Andy. The ship did sail on our ballot access, no labels, when we suspended it in April, unable, as Julia and Hans know, to find a candidate we thought could go the distance. But look, one thing you said that I would be curious to hear Julia and Hans react to, and Julia, you said this at the top. You did see an unusual amount of crosstalk last night around, I agree with, Senator Vance or Governor Walz. Both of them at different points were touting their willingness to be bipartisan. It really did seem like they were out competing one another to seem reasonable, didn't it?
I agree. And I think there is, no pun intended there, but I think there certainly is an appetite, to see that civility, to see that, a kindness, maybe that humanity between the two candidates. One moment that really struck me was when we heard Governor Walz talking about how his 17-year-old son witnessed a shooting, and J.D. Vance sort of acknowledged that, and in a sort of seemingly heartfelt way. So I think there certainly is that appetite. I think the problem, and I could go off on a tangent here, but it seems to be sort of, going back to the primary system, really, and how we've seen just our primaries right now seem to favor, primary voters seem to favor someone who is most to the, seemingly most to the left or most to the right. I guess on the Democratic side, not necessarily most to the left, but, it seems like a lot of this stems from the primary process, how, districts are drawn. You could make this argument for in the House, for example. So I think there is absolutely that appetite. I think there are, Americans who feel that they are, you hear this word silent majority, tossed around, but I think there certainly is that feeling.
Hans, did you have a thought there, or were you just?
It was interrupted by my mother, my lovely 81-year-old mother, making a parent. She's not 81, excuse me, she's 80. She's now considering scooching out of the shot on her knees. So the drama never ends in the greater DC
Tell her
area.
that she can comfortably walk out of the back.
You can come if you you go ahead and you go. If you want to leave, you can leave. I've got to be on this call for a little bit. Okay. This is almost as exciting as the time she made an appearance on Fox News a couple months ago. So this is things are no, just go ahead. Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry.
Hans, I think this is what I think you planted your mother there to win over the audience. It's like putting a cute kid in the frame.
I'm sorry. This is my thought before I kind of got distracted. The debate was so nice is because the two candidates were solving for the same problem, but a different problem they'd be solving for if they're going head to head. And they were solving for broader, like this is a kind of gross generalization, but they were solving for the niceness factor. They both wanted to improve their public sort of appearance. If they were solving for the problem of who is going to rip the other guy's throat out and show their base that they can be, and show the country that they can be the toughest, the strongest, they would have, the debate would have looked different. So yes, they were nice, but they were solving for a different problem. And I don't suspect that they would continue to be that nice if they had a series of Lincoln Douglas debates down. I think they just kind of caught lightning in the bottle, and just, the way sometimes things go in a debate, like you don't want to kind of read the room. And they both read the room, and the room was pretty small, and it was the two of them signaling that they want to be nice. So that's the direction they went in.
And I do think it was in particular very important for JD Vance to be nice and to put, forth that image. I think he's been perceived, by people who aren't his supporters, by critics, as someone who's very intense, who's very awkward, who's not relatable. The childless cat lady comments unearthed from 2021 haven't done him any favors. So he knew he was going to be on that stage next to Tim Walz, whose entire personality, entire brand is Mr. Midwestern nice guy. So I think for JD Vance, he had to do that.
Yeah, right. Agreed. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm Dennis Lopez, proudly from the great metropolis of Tampa, Florida, a lifelong independent voter. Don't be fooled by the red shirt. I'm not of that persuasion this election season. I had an observation and wanted to see if it was shared by any of the panelists or Ryan. I find it very disconcerting and rather unfortunate that the so-called swing states, which I'll defer to Ryan and the other panelists in terms of the numbers of voters that are in those states, and where the candidates seem to be spending all their time, in terms of the number of voters they're trying to persuade in those states compared to the number of voters throughout the United States, it seems that this is just another example where the electoral college needs to be abolished. And my last observation I made in this regard was when Donald Trump, about a month ago, took the podium and said, and I'm going to try to quote it verbatim, something along the lines of, to the religious right, the evangelicals, he said, you need to come out and vote. You need to come out and vote. If you come out and vote this time, you'll never have to vote again. Now, to me, that tells me that his pollsters, his people on the ground are telling him that it's so tight and so this and so that he's got to make those kind of outrageous claims to those voting blocks in those states where an extremely small percentage of Americans are going to decide this race. So that's my observation. It's disconcerting and somewhat depressing to me. And I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say about that. Pardon my dog barking in the background.
That's okay. Well, maybe Julia, we start with you. There is, of course, a movement afoot. It's called the Interstate something compact. The name is escaping me, but it's basically a bottom-up effort to get enough states on board where they would agree they'll give their electoral votes to whoever the majority vote winner is. They're short of the 270. And it doesn't look like they're going to get there anytime soon. Absent that, you'd need a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Change it.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously this movement. There's a lot of, I think, there are certainly critics, very vocal critics, many critics of the Electoral College. I was actually on another panel earlier today, and we were asked the question, I mean, do we expect to see potentially a split Electoral College versus popular vote this time around? And, I think that's very possible. But yeah, I mean, I don't see that movement really gaining any traction anytime soon. But, it is something people oftentimes, voice their concerns about and complaints about. I haven't heard too much about it on the campaign trail recently, but it's certainly, I think, something that is the movement is there.
Yeah. Hans, any thoughts on the Electoral College?
It's here to stay unless your vociferous dog can amend the Constitution. Sorry. Like, it's just the system. I mean, I've been yelled at in more left bank cafes than I care to imagine about the Electoral College, but that's just because a series of French Bolsheviks I dated in my 20s, didn't like the way the campaigns were turning out. So
yeah,
sorry.
Yep. It is almost certainly here to stay. I think we have time for just one final question. Sam.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Sam from Maryland. Just have one thought. I'd like your opinion if this theory makes any sense based regarding the lack of perceived activity in the campaign. Is it possible that the campaigns have done the calculus, given the split in the electorate, that maybe the more they talk, they're more likely to lose somebody than to gain somebody? And you're sort of better off just shutting up and hoping people come to you, as opposed to trying to attract people and actually turn more people away from you. Does that make sense?
So yeah, Hans, I mean, basically, I think what he's asking is, in sports, teams sometimes try to run out the clock to win as opposed to really pressing the pedal to the metal. Do you think there's an element of that here?
2020 kind of laid the groundwork for that, where, Biden didn't really get out and he still got it across the line. So there's a little bit of that. The short answer is I don't know. I'm not in those strategy meetings. Maybe this is all four corners offense. If it's true, it's a pretty cynical approach, which is to say, if I talk, no one will like me, so I'm going to be quiet and hope the other person talks so that people come to me. But politicians are allowed to be cynical. So I'll keep my answer brief, and then let Julia just. I'll keep my tight, and then Julia can run out the clock, and you can like my answer better.
Yeah, I mean, when you were asking that question, one thing that popped to mind is a lot of people around Trump would like him sometimes not to talk as much, or to at least stay on message. I know that Trump himself does not like to necessarily always stay on message. He likes to go off of the teleprompter, doesn't like to be teleprompter Trump. So I mean, I'm not trying to make a theory that that's the case right now. I don't think it necessarily is, but that's sort of what came to mind for me. I still think this is a unique election year. Just going back to the 2 assassination attempts against Trump, that's impacting his campaign style. I think with Harris, it's certainly been a unique year for her as well. So it's just interesting. Like I said before, 2022 actually just felt more normal for me in terms of a traditional campaign than this year has, even though I know it was a midterm year.
Well, hopefully for both of your sake, the campaigns will get off their butts and pick up the pace and give something to actually cover here. But look, thank you both for joining us. Julia Manchester from The Hill, Hans Nichols from Axios. Really appreciate both your times.
Thank you.
You bet.
And everybody, before we leave, just want to remind you, if you haven't signed up yet, we are trying to make sure people are aware of the No Labels National Meeting on December 12th. If you'd like to come, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to have you there. And until then, see you next week for the next edition of No Labels Talks.